Ossining, New York, 30 miles north of Manhattan, where the Hudson River widens toward the Tappan Zee. From the water, the landscape looks almost peaceful cliffs rising out of the gray current. But right at the river's edge sits a fortress of granite, concrete, and rusted iron. No open floodplains here, no horizon to run toward, just the weight of stone, the lap of dark water, and the shadow of a cell block built to swallow men whole. This is Sing Sing, the prison that gave the world the phrase "up the river," whispered by generations of convicts shipped north from New York City into a silent stone purgatory. Opened in 1825, Sing Sing was forged on a philosophy of total subjugation. Its original cell block wasn't raised by outside contractors, it was quarried and stacked by the very prisoners sent to occupy it, hauling marble from the riverside quarry under a rule of enforced silence. Rehabilitation wasn't the goal. Control was, and as the decades passed, that control evolved from the lash to the hum of a generator inside a small brick building the Inmates, simply called the Death House. 5 men moved through this fortress: a serial killer who turned his fists and a firebomb loose on a prison built to hold him. A crime syndicate's chief executive who discovered the law could reach him after all. An elderly predator who welcomed the electric chair as his final thrill. A teenage gunman who brought the same reckless bravado to the chair that he'd brought to a 2-hour siege in Manhattan. And a bank robber whose mind treated a 30-foot wall like a puzzle with a solution. This is Prison Files. Case number 1. Carl Panzram.
Carl Panzram was born 1891 outside what was a small farming community. After being convicted of 5 murders and committing countless other heinous crimes.
October 1923, Clinton Prison, Dannemora, New York, 10 miles from the Canadian border, and by reputation the most brutal penal institution in the state. Carl Panzram had arrived a few weeks earlier under an alias, John O'Leary, carrying a 5-year sentence out of Sing Sing for burglary. The transfer papers made him look like a routine thief. The men who processed him had no idea they were looking at one of the most prolific killers in American history. Panzram was born on June 28, 1891, on a failing farm near East Grand Forks, Minnesota, the 6th of 7 children of East Prussian immigrants. By 11, he was already in trouble with the law. At 14, after a stint in a notoriously abusive Minnesota reform school, he ran away for good riding freight cars across the country. He would later say he was gang raped by a group of transient men during those years on the rails, an experience he claimed reshaped him into something without mercy. Whether or not that account is the whole explanation for what he became, by his 20s, Panzram was a one-man crime wave: burglary, arson, robbery, sexual assault, and though no one realized it yet, murder, stretching from Montana to Oregon to the Atlantic coast, and even to a stint on a hunting expedition in Portuguese Angola. His relationship with prisons had always been the same. He came in, and eventually he found a way to test the walls. He'd escaped the Montana State Reform School in 1907, fled Montana State Prison in 1913, and broken out of the Oregon State Penitentiary not once, but twice the second time in 1918, by sawing through his cell bars with a hacksaw blade and vanishing east under his new alias. By the time he reached New York in 1923, he'd been arrested, jailed, and had slipped free of custodians more times than most career criminals manage in a lifetime. Dannemora did not tame him. Within his first week, guards discovered a firebomb he'd built in the prison workshop, intended to burn the place down. Undeterred, he waited for his moment and clubbed a sleeping guard from behind with a 10-pound length of wood, leaving the man with permanent motor control damage. Then, only weeks into his sentence, Panzram made his move. In the dead of night, he climbed toward the top of one of the prison's outer walls, using a crude, improvised ladder lashed together from whatever materials he could scavenge. It held his weight almost to the top, and then it gave way. Panzram fell 30 feet onto a concrete step below. He shattered both ankles, broke both legs, and fractured his spine. Guards found him crumpled at the base of the wall, dragged him back to a cell, and dropped him on the floor. He would receive no meaningful medical treatment for more than a year by his own account. 14 months of lying in agony with his bones never properly set. Before doctors finally operated, he would carry a limping, uneven gait for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the night the wall refused to give him up. The failed escape didn't break his spirit. If anything, it deepened his contempt for every human institution he encountered. Locked in his cell, unable to walk, Panzram began sketching out fantasies of mass destruction, dynamiting bridges to rob the wounded as they lay dying, poisoning a reservoir to wipe out an entire town. He was discharged from Dannemora in 1928, having served his time, and immediately returned to the road, continuing a spree of burglary and violence that finally ran out in Washington, D.C., where he was arrested for a routine break-in with no idea, yet, of what investigators were about to uncover. It was in a Washington jail that Panzram met a young guard named Henry Lesser, one of the only people who ever treated him with basic decency. In exchange, Panzram dictated a chilling, unflinching autobiography, confessing to 21 murders and thousands of sexual assaults across 3 decades and 2 continents. Sent to federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas, for the murder of a laundry foreman, Panzram made no attempt to save himself. He refused appeals, insulted the psychiatrists sent to evaluate him, and told the court flatly that he wanted to hang. "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry," he said before his execution. When he was hanged on September 5, 1930, he reportedly snapped at the hangman to hurry up, boasting that he could have killed a dozen men in the time it was taking to prepare the rope. His stay in New York's prison system never produced the dramatic breakout of legend: no stolen master key, no vanishing into the night. What it produced was something arguably darker: a broken body, an unrepentant mind, and a warning that some men don't need to escape a prison to remain the most dangerous thing inside it. Case number 2. Louis Lepke Buchalter.
Louis Lepke Buchalter ran Murder Incorporated, a mob hit squad responsible for up to 80 contract killings throughout the 1930s. He was convicted for ordering the 1936 murder of a candy store owner, and in 1944 he died, right here in Sing Sing's electric chair.
March 4th, 1944, Sing Sing's death house. The chamber that night carried more historical weight than almost any other in the prison's history, because Louis Lepke Buchalter wasn't going to the chair alone. 2 of his own men, Louis Capone and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, were executed just ahead of him in the same sitting, a triple execution that emptied the underworld's upper ranks in a single evening. Lepke, the most senior man in the room, went last. He was there because a Brooklyn candy store owner named Joseph Rosen had refused to leave town when he was told to, and because one of Lepke's own men happened to overhear the order to kill him. To understand how a soft-spoken garment district racketeer ended up as the only major independent American crime boss ever executed by the state, you have to go back to the Lower East Side. Louis Buchalter was born there on February 6, 1897, one of the younger children in a large family of Russian Jewish immigrants. His father ran a small hardware store, and his mother called him Lepkele Little Louis, a nickname that hardened into Lepke and stuck for life. It was, in a strange way, a household built for respectability. Most of his siblings went on to become a dentist, a pharmacist, a teacher, a rabbi. Lepke didn't. When his father died in 1909, 12-year-old Lepke was sent to live with an older sister in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and it was there that a childhood of street fighting curdled into something more organized. He started small robbing pushcarts as a teenager, the lowest rung of New York's criminal ladder. It was during one of those attempted robberies, trying to rob the same pushcart at the same moment, that he crossed paths with a much larger young man named Jacob Gura Shapiro. Lepke was short, unassuming, easy to underestimate. Shapiro supplied the muscle Lepke's 5'7" frame couldn't. Together, they joined a Lower East Side gang run by Jacob Little Augie Organ, and from there, they graduated from shaking down peddlers to something with real money behind it: labor racketeering. by exerting pressure on both employers and unions in New York's garment trade. Lepke and Shapiro didn't just extort businesses, they effectively ran entire industries, dictating wages, prices, and who got to work at all. The rackets spread to trucking, baking, and fur. At the height of it, Lepke was pulling in an estimated fortune every year, insulated from prosecution by corrupted officials and terrified witnesses. But an enforcement arm built on quiet intimidation eventually needs killers. And by the early 1930s, Lepke had assembled a loose, brutally efficient squad of hired gunmen that prosecutors would later nickname Murder, Incorporated, the enforcement wing of the broader national crime syndicate. It operated less like a street gang and more like a subcontracted service, dispatching men across the country to carry out contract killings on the syndicate's orders, all while Lepke himself stayed several layers removed. On September 13, 1936, that machinery turned on Joseph Rosen, a former garment trucker whose union route Lepke had taken away. Rosen had been talking, or Lepke believed he had, to a rising special prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey, and when Rosen refused to simply disappear from the city, Lepke ordered him killed. Gunmen shot Rosen dead in his own candy store. For years, no one was charged. That single murder became the thread that eventually unraveled everything. Dewey had already spent years quietly building cases against Lepke's rackets, using subpoenas and the threat of long sentences to squeeze cooperation out of low-level operatives. The pressure grew so severe that in 1937, Lepke simply vanished, going underground for nearly 2 years, while a joint reward of $50,000, an enormous sum for the era, sat unclaimed, because everyone who might have collected it was too frightened of what Lepke's remaining men would do to an informer. In 1939, believing he'd negotiated a deal that would spare him the murder charges, Lepke arranged to surrender personally to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The deal, if it ever really existed, didn't hold. He was first convicted on federal narcotics charges and sent to Leavenworth, but the case that would kill him was still coming. In 1940, one of Lepke's own hitmen, Abe Kid Twist Reles, turned state's evidence, and the wall of silence that had protected the organization for a decade began to come apart. Reles testified that he had personally overheard Lepke give the order on Rosen, extradited back to Brooklyn to stand trial for the murder. Lepke was convicted on November 30, 1941, and sentenced to death 2 days later alongside his lieutenants, Louis Capone and Emanuel Weiss, the same 2 men who would walk to the chair just ahead of him. His lawyers fought the verdict all the way to the New York Court of Appeals, which upheld the conviction by a narrow 4-3 vote in 1942, and pushed for executive clemency that never came. Through it all, the underworld watched Sing Sing's death house with real anxiety. If Lepke talked, if he named the men above him in the syndicate to buy his own life, the entire structure of organized crime in New York could have come down with him. He never did. In a statement dictated from his cell and written down by his wife word for word, he insisted he hadn't offered information in exchange for clemency, and never would, saying he was willing to go to the chair regardless of what he knew. On the night of March 4, 1944, Capone and Weiss were led to the chair first, in quick succession. Lepke went last, refusing to speak to the reporters gathered to hear whatever names he might finally give up. The switch was thrown at 11:13 p.m. He was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. Lepke Buchalter remains, to this day, the only major independent American mafia boss ever put to death by the state rather than by his own rivals. His execution didn't just close a case file, it shattered the underworld's working assumption that money, muscle, and silence could always buy a way out from under the law. Case number 3, Albert Fish.
Albert Fish was a serial predator and cannibal who terrorized New York families for years. He was finally convicted for the horrific 1928 murder of a young girl named Grace Budd. In 1936, he was sent to Sing Sing's electric chair, welcoming his own execution as a thrill.
January 16, 1936. A cold winter night inside the Sing Sing execution chamber. A frail, silver-haired 65-year-old man walked with almost gentle composure toward the electric chair. To a stranger passing him on the street, he might have looked like a harmless, elderly handyman. In reality, he was Albert Fish, a sadistic predator, child killer, and self-described cannibal whose crimes shocked a nation that thought it had already seen the worst of what people were capable of, and he was there because of a single, taunting letter he never should have sent. Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870, the youngest child in a family already touched by instability. Several relatives, including his own mother, struggled with mental illness. His father, more than 40 years older than his mother, died when Fish was just 5, and his mother, unable to support him alone, placed him in an orphanage, where he later said he was routinely beaten, an experience he claimed sparked a lifelong, disturbing fascination with pain, both inflicted and endured. He took the name Albert after a dead sibling, in part to escape a cruel nickname the other orphans had given him. For decades afterward, Fish led an almost impossibly ordinary double life. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, deeply religious house painter, an odd jobs man who had married, raised 6 children, largely on his own, after his wife left him in 1917, and never so much as raised a hand to any of them. In private, going back at least to the 1910s, he stalked and abused children across multiple states, later boasting in claims police could never fully verify that he'd had victims in every state. By the mid-1920s, his compulsions had escalated into something psychiatrists would later struggle to even categorize: ritualized self-mutilation with needles he inserted into his own body, self-flagellation with nail-studded paddles, and a growing conviction that God himself was commanding him to hurt children as a form of sacrifice. That conviction reached its most infamous expression in June 1928. Answering a classified ad placed by 18-year-old Edward Budd, who was looking for farm work, an elderly man calling himself Frank Howard appeared at the Budd family's Manhattan apartment, presenting himself as a wealthy retired farmer with work to offer. He returned the following week and, with the family's reluctant permission, took the Budds' 10-year-old daughter, Grace, uptown for what he claimed was a birthday party for his niece. She was never seen alive again. Fish murdered and, by his own later confession, cannibalized her at a remote cottage in Westchester County. For nearly 6 years, the case went cold. Then, in November 1934, the Budd family received an unsigned letter describing in horrifying detail exactly what had happened to their daughter. It was old-fashioned, methodical police work that finally cracked it open. A small printed emblem on the envelope's flap was traced to a chauffeurs' benevolent association, and from there detectives worked through the group's membership until a janitor came forward and admitted he had carried home some of the association's leftover stationery that had passed through a rooming house, where Fish had briefly stayed. Detectives arrested Fish there on December 13, 1934. When Edward Budd, now a grown man, was brought face to face with him at the police station, he lunged at the old man in fury. Fish, apparently untouched by any of it, greeted Mr. Budd by name with unsettling politeness. Fish's trial for Grace Budd's murder opened on March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York, and lasted 10 days. His attorney, James Dempsey, mounted an insanity defense built on Fish's history of self-harm, his religious delusions, and psychiatric testimony, most notably from Dr. Frederick Wortham, who called Fish the most extreme case of combined sexual pathology he had ever encountered, and testified flatly that Fish did not know right from wrong. Prosecutors countered with their own psychiatrists, who insisted Fish was legally sane, and pressed the argument that only a rational, functioning mind could have planned the abduction with such patience. In one of the trial's most gruesome moments, a box containing some of Grace Budd's remains was brought into the courtroom as evidence over defense objections. The jury needed only about an hour to reach a verdict: guilty, and legally sane enough to be held responsible. Several jurors later admitted privately that they believed Fish probably was insane. They simply felt he deserved to die regardless. Sentenced to death, Fish was transported to Sing Sing, where he went on to baffle prison staff in an entirely different way. He wasn't afraid of the electric chair. If anything, he seemed to welcome it, describing electrocution to visitors as one more novel sensation to experience. in keeping with a life built around inflicting and enduring pain. That fascination left a physical mark investigators had already discovered on X-rays taken during his incarceration needles Fish had inserted into his own body over the years, embedded deep enough that technicians preparing him for execution struggled to properly attach the leg electrode through the scarring. By several accounts, Fish tried to help them position it correctly, entirely detached from the horror of his own impending death. He entered the chamber shortly after 11 p.m. on January 16, 1936. His last words, delivered with the same odd calm that had unsettled everyone around him for years, were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Witnesses said it took 2 jolts of the current before he was finally declared dead, feeding rumors, never confirmed, that the needles buried in his legs had briefly short-circuited the chair. The man newspapers had nicknamed the Gray Man was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. His file remains one of the darkest ever logged at the facility, a case still taught in criminology courses today, as a study in how ordinary someone monstrous can appear from the outside. Case number 4. Francis Two-Gun Crowley.
Francis Two-Gun Crowley was a 19-year-old street killer who went on a relentless spree of car thefts and armed robberies. In 1931, he shot an NYPD officer dead during a simple traffic stop. Just 1 year later, in 1932, his run ended in Old Sparky.
January 21st, 1932, Sing Sing's death house was ready for a 19-year-old who had lived his entire short life at breakneck speed. Francis Two-Gun Crowley walked toward the electric chair with the same sneering, arrogant swagger that had made him a tabloid sensation during the Public Enemy era of the early 1930s, the same swagger that, less than a year earlier, had kept 300 police officers pinned down in a 2-hour gun battle on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Crowley was born on Halloween, 1912, into a difficult start in life. His young mother placed him in foster care not long after his birth, and he was raised by a foster mother who ran what was known at the time as a baby farm, taking in unwanted children for a fee. He grew up small, barely over 5 feet tall, and around 110 pounds as an adult, and quiet, dropping out of school after the 3rd grade. Violence found him early. In 1925, when Francis was about 12, his older brother John was shot dead by police following a shootout in which John was accused of killing an officer himself. By his mid-teens, Francis was running with a loose gang of car thieves and small-time stick-up men around New York City and Long Island, boosting cars, robbing drugstores, and haunting the dance halls where he met the girlfriends who would later testify against him. He earned his nickname because he refused to move anywhere without a loaded pistol strapped to each hip, a habit that turned lethal on May 6, 1931. That night, on a quiet road in Merrick, Long Island, Nassau County Patrolman Frederick Hirsch and his partner, Peter Yodesy, approached a parked car to ask the young men inside for identification, a routine stop, nothing more. Crowley answered with gunfire, killing Hirsch on the spot and wounding Yodi. The murder of a police officer triggered an immediate, sprawling manhunt across Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Long Island, with Nassau County Police, nipped detectives, and eventually the press all chasing leads on a killer, barely out of his teens. The break came through Crowley's own recklessness with women. A jilted former girlfriend, furious after Crowley threw her out of her own apartment to move in his new girlfriend, 16-year-old Helen Walsh, and an accomplice named Rudolph Fats Duringer, tipped off a newspaper reporter to their location, a 5th-floor apartment at 303 West 90th Street in Manhattan. What followed, on May 7, 1931, became known as the Siege of 90th Street, one of the most extraordinary standoffs in New York policing history. Roughly 300 officers surrounded the building as an estimated crowd of thousands, some accounts put it as high as 15,000, packed the surrounding streets to watch, some ducking behind parked cars as stray rounds cracked overhead. Police fired an estimated 700 rounds into the apartment and dropped tear gas canisters through a hole chopped in the roof, only for Crowley to fire back up through the ceiling and hurl the smoking canisters back out into the street. For nearly 2 hours, machine gun fire echoed through the neighborhood and small fires broke out along the block, while Crowley, bleeding from multiple wounds, kept firing with both pistols until his ammunition finally ran out. When officers stormed the apartment, they found on him a handwritten note that read, in part, "Under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm." As he was carried out on a stretcher, still defiant, cheering spectators pressed in for a look. Officers later discovered 2 more loaded pistols strapped to his legs inside his socks, apparently intended for one last shootout in the ambulance. Justice moved fast. Held at Bellevue Hospital under guard while he recovered from his wounds, Crowley was indicted within days for Hirsch's murder, and his trial opened in Mineola on May 26, 1931, built largely on the testimony of Helen Walsh, who described the shooting in detail. Barely 3 weeks after the siege that made him famous, Crowley was convicted and, on June 1, 1931, sentenced to death the same fate that awaited his accomplice Duringer, convicted separately of murdering a dance hall hostess. At Sing Sing, Crowley treated death row like a stage built for his own legend, mocking guards and insisting the state was simply jealous of his notoriety. Duringer went to the chair first, on December 10, 1931. When Crowley's own turn came 6 weeks later, he reportedly asked the warden for a rag to wipe down the chair before sitting in it, saying he wanted to clean off the seat after that rat had used it, a request that was denied. Accounts of his actual final words differ. Some witnesses recalled a quiet message for his mother and for Warden Lewis Laws's wife, thanking her for her kindness during his imprisonment. Other, more sensational versions circulating in the press had him delivering a defiant line aimed squarely at the chair itself. Whichever version is true, the moment was brief. Crowley was 19 years old when the switch was thrown, a short, violent burst of Depression-era outlaw myth that Sing Sing's electric chair permanently silenced. Case number 5. Willie Sutton.
Willie Sutton was a master bank robber who stole over $2 million across a multi-year crime spree. In December of 1932, he used a makeshift ladder to scale the walls of Sing Sing and escape. He avoided the electric chair completely, eventually dying a free man in 1979.
December 11th, 1932, inside Sing Sing's walls, Willie Sutton, a meticulous, soft-spoken bank robber, already building a reputation as one of the era's most inventive criminals, had spent weeks quietly preparing for a single night. He was there on a 30-year sentence for assault and robbery, handed down in June 1931, the latest stop in a criminal career that, unlike almost every other man in this episode, had been built without ever firing a shot at another human being. Sutton was born William Francis Sutton, Jr. in Brooklyn on June 30, 1901, the fourth of 5 children in an Irish-American family living in the tough Vinegar Hill neighborhood near the Navy Yard, where his father worked as a blacksmith. He was a difficult, restless student, bouncing between half a dozen schools after fights and thefts, and he left formal education behind for good around the 8th grade. His longest stretch at an honest job lasted 18 months. By his early 20s, he'd already been arrested and acquitted on a murder charge and served a prison term for safecracking from 1926 to 1927. After his release, he graduated from cracking safes to robbing banks and jewelry stores outright, and it was here that his signature style emerged, rather than relying on brute force. Sutton preferred elaborate disguises: a Western Union messenger, a mailman, a police officer, a maintenance man to walk directly through a business's front door before it even opened. His first bank job, in 1930, was pulled off dressed as a telegraph messenger. That same year, he and an accomplice robbed a Broadway jewelry store the same way, netting well over $100,000 in gems. A botched attempt to torch through a bank floor with an acetylene tank led to his first robbery conviction, and in June 1931, a separate assault and robbery charge sent him to Sing Sing with 30 years hanging over him. It approached bank robbery less like a criminal enterprise and more like a craft, and prison was no different. Sutton took pride in the fact that he never fired a shot in the course of an actual robbery, and his calm, courteous manner combined with real respect from the underworld made him popular even among more violent inmates. It earned him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Willie the actor. Working with a fellow inmate, John Egan, Sutton had gotten hold of hacksaw blades, and over a period of time the two men patiently sawed through one of the bottom bars of their respective cells, careful not to be caught mid-cut. On the night of the escape, once the cell bars gave way, Sutton, an accomplished lockpicker, worked his way through a sequence of interior doors, at least one of which he was never fully able to explain picking, fueling decades of speculation about whether an inside guard had quietly helped him along. He and Egan made their way down to a basement beneath the prison mess hall, where they surprised a trustee named John Titch, bound and gagged him, and located two wooden ladders. The two men lashed the ladders together with wire to create a single extended length capable of reaching the top of Sing Sing's roughly 30-foot outer wall, at a stretch of the perimeter that wasn't covered by a manned guard tower during the late evening hours, a blind spot Sutton had reportedly mapped out in advance, with a getaway car arranged during a prison visit from his wife days earlier. Sutton and Egan scaled the joined ladder and dropped down on the far side, vanishing into the New York night. It was one of the very few successful breakouts in the modern history of a prison that had been engineered, on paper, to make exactly this kind of escape impossible. Sutton's freedom didn't last long. Egan was shot dead in a New York City speakeasy the following February, and Sutton himself, after a botched attempt to rob Philadelphia's Corn Exchange Bank disguised as a postman, was finally captured there in February 1934. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years at Eastern State Penitentiary, and even that wasn't the end of his relationship with prison walls. He escaped again in 1945 through a tunnel with 11 other inmates, only to be recaptured the same day, and in 1947 he broke out of Philadelphia's Holmesburg prison a third time by simply carrying a ladder across the yard in a stolen guard's uniform and telling the men in the watchtower not to worry about it. Sutton was eventually recaptured for good in February 1952, tipped off by a young man named Arnold Schuster, who was murdered soon afterward, not by Sutton, but reportedly on the orders of a mob boss who despised informants. Sutton spent much of the rest of his life behind bars before ill health finally won him a commuted sentence and release on Christmas Eve, 1969. When a reporter later asked him, in an exchange that has never been definitively confirmed, why he robbed banks, the answer attributed to him has outlived almost everything else about his career. Because that's where the money is. Sutton himself always denied ever saying it, but by then, he admitted, it hardly mattered. It was already everywhere. Go back to the edge of the Hudson, to a prison built out of the very rock it sits on the idea that stone walls and enforced silence could contain the most volatile forces in society. Every file in this episode tested that idea differently. Panzram proved that raw, predatory rage doesn't need a key to remain dangerous. Sometimes it just needs a body that refuses to be broken, even when the wall breaks it first. Lepke proved that the machinery of organized crime would eventually collide with the machinery of the state and lose. Fish proved that the darkest monsters don't always fear their punishment. Sometimes they welcome it as one final experience. Crowley proved that street-level bravado always runs out of road somewhere, even if the exact final words get lost to legend. And Willie Sutton proved that patience, a hacksaw blade, and a blind spot in a guard's rotation could still beat a fortress built to be unbeatable. The cells have been modernized. The old quarry has gone quiet. Old Sparky has long since been disconnected. But the river keeps moving past the walls, carrying the memory of the hundreds of men who took their last breath inside the death house. The ledger stays carved in the granite. The count doesn't close. That's Prison Files. Tell us in the comments which case or which facility you want open next.